Right, it is 11 a.m. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. Hope you can hear me clearly and the audio is coming through okay. And I do hope everybody survived the last couple of days in this very extreme weather that we've had. And you've all managed to keep cool and hydrated. So, as always, thanks for joining myself in today's session in association with Conveyancing Data Services. My name is Danielle. Always a bit housekeeping before we go. You should see a control panel on your screen which allows you to ask written questions. Please feel free to submit these as we go along, and we'll try and get these answered either during or after the webinar. I am working from home today. Hopefully there is no background noise. I had somebody's car alarm go off yesterday, but hopefully it should be nice and quiet and clear. We are recording today's session, so if you'd like a copy of the slides or a copy of the recording, please do reach out afterwards and we'll get that over to you. And as always, your feedback is a gift, so there will be a short survey that will launch after today's session, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take a few seconds to provide your valuable feedback. So today I'm going to be talking about agricultural land transactions. Sorry. The legislation for this doesn't really change too much. So for those who have attended one of these sessions before, it will be very similar. Agricultural land transactions are definitely a lot more complex in some aspects and in some ways, primarily due to the contamination aspect of things. We have put up some of the definitions of what agricultural land is on the screen for you. So from an environmental risk perspective, it is quite different to other commercial land uses. And when we talk about agricultural land transactions, it is agricultural land that is staying in agricultural use. So for the purposes of today, for those of you who do a mixture of commercial transactions, you've primarily got majority of the transactions that we deal with are actually non-agricultural. So I would say, 90 odd some percent are commercial properties that stay in the same land use. There's no major change in land use. In terms of contamination perspective, it's fairly straightforward. That's most of the commercial transactions that we deal with. Then we have some scenarios where there's a lot of contamination potential there because somebody is doing some major redevelopment to a piece of land. And again, that's something that we would look at with a slightly different report, like a review. Whereas agricultural kind of sits in its own bubble. It is very niche. From a land use perspective, it's complex. It has unique characteristics and risk factors that need to be taken into consideration, and it cannot really be treated the same as, let's say, a redevelopment from a commercial to residential or vice versa, or another industrial land use that is staying the same. So agricultural land transactions are unique in that respect, and a huge part of it is because of the chemicals and the environmental contamination that could potentially arise from agricultural land uses, which is why it needs to be treated differently. The procedure when buying agricultural land is fairly similar to buying another piece of freehold or leasehold land, but there is a separate section within the conveyancing handbook which specifies that additional issues are investigated during the purchase of agricultural land. Now, whilst historically back in the day, individual inquiries had to be raised for each of the things that you can see on the screen, either during pre-contract searches or through the seller, it could be very, very time consuming because that's a lot of information that you had to kind of try and find out individually, which is why a few years ago when we were looking at our agricultural report, we tried to ensure that where possible, everything you see on the screen and within the conveyancing handbook is actually covered in our agricultural reports. And that wasn't always the case previously, and that's not always the case with other reports. But again, using the conveyancing handbook as a guide, all of the points that you see on the screen are what we address within the report. So it's very, very different to a bog standard commercial transaction, because there's a whole bunch of information in there that you wouldn't really take into consideration in certain aspects of another type of commercial transaction. Now, in terms of looking at general stats, the total agricultural area in the UK is it hovers, I think, between 17 and 18 million hectares, with an additional 3+ million hectares covered by things like woodlands and forests. So the agricultural area, excluding woodland, accounts for about 72% of the total area of land. And these are stats. They're a little bit out of date now, but this is from Savills back in 2019. And so it's a significant piece of land mass in the UK, and it's very, very important, of course, for our day-to-day living. Now, the UK's most common agricultural impacts are associated with the use of pesticides, nitrogen compounds, livestock waste, and soil erosion, which tend to revolve, of course, around working farms and farming in general, and intense farming. And there are numerous environmental impacts arising from farming processes, which affect things like water bodies, which of course can impact human health and the ecology. And so I'm going to go through a couple processes in the upcoming slides, and some of the top picks of what we look at, particularly when it comes to agricultural land. So infilled land, fuel storage, slurry and waste, agricultural chemicals, and permits and licenses. These are all really, really important. And in terms of just following on the environmental impacts, what other types of impacts are we looking at when we talk about farming processes? Surface water, groundwater pollution, the chemicals that we use, the acidification of the ground due to the use of fertilizers, that's a big issue. Of course, greenhouse gas emissions and how that contributes to the climate. But you have other things like local disturbances, so odor and noise, or the spreading of contaminative materials like heavy metals or pesticides or toxic substances and pathogens all across the ground. And so, these are the types of things that we need to be thinking about. And environmental risks associated with farming are commonly linked with the operational activities as of the ones you see on the screen. So let's take a closer look at each of these. So when we talk about infilled land, and again, this crops up a lot in agricultural pieces of land, and bearing in mind with agricultural reports, the size banding is actually different to our other commercial reports. We look at pieces of land from 0 to 50 hectares in the first size banding. That's like the first, size band within an agricultural report, and then it goes from 50 to 100 and upwards. Now, our historical mapping often allows us to identify things like ponds, disused workings, or quarries across areas of agricultural land. Now, if over time we can no longer see these features on mapping, or even visually, then this indicates that they may have been infilled. And these areas can often be infilled with waste from nearby land uses, including things like farms and mines. And unless the infilled land has recently held or currently holds an environmental permit specifying the waste accepted, we can't always determine the exact contents of that potentially infilled area, which is why it's a concern. Infilled land has many possible environmental risks associated with it, and the severity is determined by the amount and the type of waste the area is infilled with, the underlying geology and hydrogeology, and the proximity to people or other organisms that may be significantly affected by exposure to contaminants really does matter. Infilled land, if it's not managed correctly, can result in things like groundwater pollution, soil fertility issues, air pollution, and the release of greenhouse gases like methane. Consequently, human health can be at risk if pollutants filter into groundwater, of course, used for drinking water, and if the gases build up in units on infilled areas. And often prior to construction, a local planning department will request the use of adequate control measures such as gas membranes and or gas monitoring schemes across areas affected. So to give you an example, we undertook a phase 1 environmental assessment at a farm which was undergoing modernization with the development of something called an anaerobic digestion plant, or an ADP. And prior to the construction of the ADP, the client raised the development area by moving in material from unspecified heaps across the rest of the site. So big site, lots of potential building materials, and of course, makes sense. If you've got materials around, you want to use them. Now, this infilling and raising operations has the potential to cause issues if these materials to be used aren't tested for contamination. Now, if the materials were found to be contaminated, moving them around the site would spread contamination across the development area. However, in this particular situation, Groundsure assessed the waste to be suitable for construction purposes. And this is a good example where infilling or use of material to raise land could potentially cause environmental issues. I've just had a question come through from somebody saying that they don't have any sound. I haven't had anybody else say so. I'm hoping that that has sorted itself out now. So please do let me know if there is any more, if somebody could comment to say if there's any other sound issues, but hopefully that's worked itself out. So apologies for that. Hopefully that's all cleared up. So that, as I said, to finish off, this is where infilled land can be quite an issue when it comes to agricultural land. Next, moving on to fuel storage. So, of course, on working farms and agricultural land, they tend to store a lot of fuel on site. And an example of these, fuel storage regulations. So there's a lot of regulations and governing when it comes to fuel storage on farms as such. And an example breach of these regulations would be if the storage tank is single skinned and doesn't have a separate bund around a tank, kind of like the ones that you see on the screen. Now, a bund is a containment facility around the tank. If the tank leaks, then the leak will be contained by the bund. So think of it like a moat, basically. In the event of a leak or spillage, there would be nothing to stop a pollution incident without a bund, and therefore an unbunded tank is a higher environmental risk if we see them. Bunded tanks must be designed to contain over 110% of the tank's capacity to meet the water resources regulations. So nowadays, the most common tanks on farms are modern plastic and self-bunded, which means they're structurally much stronger than traditional old tanks. In addition to causing potential contamination of soil, leaks from tanks have the potential to percolate into underlying aquifers, which of course is where our water is. And this is particularly important if the aquifer lies within something called a source protection zone and is being used for drinking water. So as you can imagine, I don't think any of us would like any type of fuel in our water. In addition, leaks could run into sensitive rivers or streams and affect the ecosystems within them. So fuel storage is definitely a factor that we have to take into consideration when we're looking at agricultural land. Now, to give you an example, in September of 2017, a farmer in Northumberland was actually under investigation by the Environment Agency after moving a heating oil tank in close proximity to a stream, and the tank actually slipped off the forklift as it was being moved, and it polluted a nearby stream and river. And this was the second incident at this farm, and both incidents were looking to incur fines for the farmer. So this really highlights the importance of considering the location of watercourses when installing and moving fuel storage. And of course, farmers should be aware of this, but of course, for clients that you have that are looking at agricultural land, these are the types of things that they want to be looking at and take into consideration as well. So it's far, far more complex than one would think. Another common issue when it comes to agricultural land is, of course, the storage of slurry and waste. So farming and agricultural land uses and produces a large amount of waste. A survey completed quite a long time ago in England showed 93% of all agricultural waste was natural waste, like slurry and manure. And slurry is a mixture of manure and water, which is broken down over time by bacteria. And the decomposition process forms gases like methane, which of course is a really well-known greenhouse gas. And often slurry is stored over the winter months until it's suitable for spreading during the following growing season. It's used a lot for fertilizer and spread across arable farmland. And slurry can be stored in different ways, but it's typically stored in, again, large tanks and occasionally in something called a slurry lagoon or a pond. Not something you want to be going swimming in. Now, the Water Resources Regulations 2010 state the requirements for slurry storage systems. So again, there's a lot of these overarching regulations that we all have to adhere to when it comes to agricultural land. And the regulations specify the maximum quantity of slurry that can be stored, and that it must be stored more than 10 meters away from any inland freshwater or coastal waters. In addition, farmers are provided with health and safety executive fact sheets, which help assist them with slurry storage and guidance. Now, slurry storage becomes a significant environmental concern when regulations, of course, are not adhered to or guidance isn't followed. In 2014, an incident at a farm in Northern Ireland led to the deaths of, unfortunately, an 8-year-old boy when he inhaled lethal fumes which had collected over a slurry tank. And he was helping his dad mix the slurry, and they both felt rather unwell after inhaling hydrogen sulfide and other lethal gases produced by the slurry. And this is why agricultural land has a lot of regulations and guidance that needs to be adhered to. It's also an issue if it's stored too close to surface water features or waterlogged ground, because this can lead to things like pollution incidents and the disruption of local freshwater ecosystems. There have been incidents and they're often investigated, and sometimes they do lead to penalties. Basically, another example is B&M Elkin and Son, where the Environment Agency fined them over £14,000 after thousands of fish were killed when slurry leaked into a nearby brook. And all other waste stored at farms is described as non-natural waste. So apart from the usual slurry and waste, we're also talking about other types of waste like disused pesticide containers, tires, batteries, plastic, oil, and around 135,000 tons of agricultural waste plastic is produced each year. I suspect even more now because these are probably out of date. So not only are hazardous wastes and chemicals stored on agricultural land, but also there's the issue of disposal. And the disposal of these hazardous wastes must adhere to various guidelines that have been, again, set out by the various organizations in England, Wales, Scotland, as well as Northern Ireland. So, that all needs to be looked at. Now, in order to keep up with consumer demand for high volumes of produce, most farmers believe that they need to use fertilizer as ways to maintain the soil health. And in order for soil used for farming purposes to maintain a high level of efficiency, it's important that the soil isn't depleted of nutrients, thereby affecting the quality and size of the yield. And after each growing cycle, crops will have absorbed specific nutrients, often leaving soil depleted or, chemically changed, which is why we keep using fertilizer. However, if we overuse fertilizers, that can actually lead to something called soil salinity or heavy metal accumulation or nitrate accumulation. Those are all issues that also need to be taken into account when we're looking at agricultural land transactions. In May of 2017, a farmer, the same farmer who moved the previously mentioned fuel tank and polluted a river, they spilled 3,000 liters of liquid fertilizer into a surface water feature, which killed about 2,000 fish and 60 critically endangered eels. Now, this pollution incident affected the watercourse for 6 miles over 4 days. And this shows the highly negative effects that excessive fertilizer can cause. And of course, in this case, it was a spill. But persistent use of fertilizers over many growing seasons can have similar effects to watercourses as well as the ground. Also, something we look into and have to touch on is rights of way, particularly when it comes to agricultural land. And bearing in mind, I've talked a lot about farms, but agricultural land isn't just farms, of course. It could be woodland, it could be heathland, it could be pasture land. We do have people that buy agricultural pieces of land like woods, not to necessarily do anything with them. They'll buy a piece, a plot of land with woods in it, and they want to keep it that way. In some cases, I've heard of clients buying woodland, and they just want to keep it for camping. um, you know, private camping for their family. And this is kind of where things like rights of way are important. Back in the 2000s, the Labour government introduced a right to roam clause, which stated that any pre-1949 pass must be recorded by 2026 to continue to carry public rights. And the Countryside and Rights of Way Act contained a provision that will extinguish those rights if the paths have not been properly recorded. So why should farmers care, or why would not even just farmers, but why would anybody looking at agricultural land want to know? Now, whilst the registering of these pre-1949 paths may not benefit the owner of the land, because it means there's a public footpath crossing their land, the landowner should be aware that anyone can register a pre-1949 path with the local authority for it to be included in the definitive plan. And there's various projects that are being worked on to do this. So I guess also it depends on whether or not you are bothered, or as an agricultural landowner or looking to purchase an agricultural piece of land, whether or not having public footpaths is important to you going across your land. If you're buying woodland and you want to be camping there publicly, you kind of want to know whether or not there's going to be members of the public walking across your land. At random. You don't necessarily want to be surprised, but also there's some aspects of thinking about maintenance and whatnot. So again, these are things that we get asked about as well, and these are also included within the report. So there's all sorts of really interesting complex factors when it comes to agricultural land. Again, it's very unusual, and I would say it's very unique to that type of land transaction, as opposed to, an office block or a retail unit, or if you're looking at buying a piece of land and converting it to residences. It is very, very much slightly different when it comes to agricultural land and some of the issues that comes with it. Another kind of common concern are permits and licenses. So, intensive farming, often large scale, undertake agricultural practices at a commercial level, and these types of farms generally require a permit in order to operate, particularly for processes like livestock farming, so poultry farming, where there are certain limits on the number of poultry birds that can be housed. The permits often issued are what we call Part A1 permits, and they outline the correct operation parameters for large-scale agricultural farms. Now, the Environment Agency monitor these permitted farms to ensure that processes are being completed under the agreed terms of the permit or the license that's been issued. The risk for permitted sites is that companies don't always stay within the terms of the permit, and on occasion may breach these conditions. Surprise, surprise. These breaches can, of course, cause significant pollution incidents, leading to, again, farmers being fined and potential for environmental damage occurring. Now, further environmental permits often held by farms are associated, like I mentioned earlier, with waste storage, processing, or treatment facilities. In recent years, farming has moved towards becoming more sustainable, which is great. And some farms have developed ADPs to allow them to process their own waste and to become less dependent on fossil fuels, which, again, it's a wonderful step to go towards, but it's not always easy. Over 1,000 plants were active by the mid-2010s and often require permits issued by the EA due to their scale of production. So to give you another example, Groundsure carried out a phase 1 environmental risk assessment at a farm, which had an environmental permit for processes associated with the storage and the production of fertilizers. Now, the consultations with the EA confirmed that this permit was still currently active. However, when environmental consultants from Groundsure completed their site visit, they saw that the processes associated with the permit actually weren't no longer in place. And the owner of the property advised that they had kept the permit in an active status as they believed it would add value to the property. Now, Groundsure advised the owner that although it may appeal to buyers, it may in fact devalue the property from an environmental risk perspective. Surrendering a permit often means the site must be returned back to its previous format. For example, if any contamination occurred due to the processes stated within the permit, this would have to be remediated prior to surrendering the permit. As a result, from an environmental liability perspective, having a surrendered permit is reassuring, and it is possible that lenders may favor this more during transactions as the environmental risk is far lower. So just something to take into consideration. You've also got things like sheep dips. Again, sheep dip chemicals were developed in the 19th century and would at the time commonly include something like arsenic and arsenic-based compounds, which were used all the way up until the 1950s and can still remain in soil surrounding historical sheep dip baths. Whilst not as toxic as arsenic, the modern compounds that they use now are still not exactly safe for human health. You've got something called organophosphates, and organophosphate exposure can cause very serious conditions like a coma. It can cause vomiting, it can cause diarrhea. So over a long term, they can really cause more long-term health issues with fertility, with cancer, with brain and nerve problems. It's also quite interesting to note that organophosphates are the basis of the nerve agent Novichok, which was used in that Salisbury attack that's been in the media. So, if you do have a client that is looking at sheep dips or kind of intensive farming, livestock farming, these are the types of things to be aware of, because the chemicals used in these types of agricultural activities are not what I would consider pleasant and require a huge amount of safety, but also are huge potentials when we're looking at environmental risk and liability. So lots of guidelines, lots of safety has to be put in place. And of course, it can be costly. What other things do we look at? Tree felling licenses. So felling license applications or felling license application areas approved by Forestry Commission, or they are approved by the Forestry Commission in England. Now, anyone wishing to fell trees must ensure that a license or permission under a grant scheme has been issued by the Forestry Commission before any felling is carried out, or that one of the exceptions within the guidelines applies. 8 hectares of woodland within the Gower area of outstanding natural beauty have been illegally felled by a landowner in what has been described as one of the worst offenses of its kind seen in 30 years. So here you see lots of trees. There you see those are gone. A chap by the name of Jeff Lane felled more than 8 hectares of native and wet woodland to the north of Ilston. That's the equivalent of 12 football pitches without holding an appropriate license. And he was actually found guilty at Swansea Magistrates Court of breaching Section 17 of the Forestry Act, along with non-compliance with an enforcement notice to restock trees which he had previously felled, and this was back in 2019. So it's understood he has appealed the conviction, and investigating officers for Natural Resources Wales first attended the site back in 2019 following a report of illegal felling. So yeah, stuff like this also unfortunately comes with agricultural land. Woodland loss is devastating. So if you do have clients that are looking at agricultural land or pieces of land that have woodlands in them. Felling licenses are very important, and making sure that the land is being treated properly, because woodland loss is actually quite devastating, you know, at any point in time, not just in this country, but anywhere. So that is one of the aspects of agricultural land transactions that you also want to be taking into consideration as well. Things like felling licenses and whatnot. Now, we thought we'd show you some pollution incidents when it comes to agricultural land, because I think it is important to show these types of incidents as well. And I think these are somewhat recent, sadly. So back in 2020, as you can see, just 14% of English rivers were rated as being in healthy condition. For the first time, no river achieved good status. There have been no prosecutions or fines issued to farms by the Environment Agency, despite 243 violations of legislation designed to curb the agricultural pollution of waterways in England. So this is specifically about waterways. Sewage wastewater discharges by water companies into rivers account for damage to 36% of waterways and runoff from agricultural industries. And basically, the agricultural industry is responsible for 40% of the damage, according to the Environment Agency. Places like the Wye, or the River Wye, is feared to be one of the worst affected rivers. A report by the Campaign for Rural England in 2019 said there were 500 farms with a total of 1,420 intensive poultry sheds containing over 44 million birds around the countries of Shropshire, Herefordshire, and Radnorshire, raising concerns about pollution of water systems. And a spokesperson for Noble Foods told The Guardian that they take their responsibility to protect the environment extremely seriously, and they have been working in close collaboration with various agricultural food partnerships and the Wye River Trust Soil Erosion Group to develop long-term solutions to this complex situation that affects the entire agricultural industry. And it's their aim to deliver a plan that can successfully be implemented across the farming sector. This one's a pretty controversial one. I think definitely certain parts of the the government as well as agricultural organizations are looking at incidents like this, because it does affect everybody, and it does affect agricultural land. And a lot of agricultural land sits around rivers. So this is potentially something that your client definitely wants to be aware of, and incidents like this are definitely one that you want to be keeping an eye on in your local area if you are looking at farms. This is another one that was actually very recent, and it was in the news very recently. One of the UK's biggest dairy firms was fined £1.5 million for repeatedly polluting a river near its Cornwall factory and causing local residents to suffer years of noxious smells. And the problems are actually continuing. So Dairy Crest was sentenced at Truro Crown Court for repeatedly breaching its environmental permit at its creamery in Camelford. The site, the UK's largest dairy processing facility, makes Cathedral City cheese, Clover, Country Life butter, and the court heard how in 2016, Dairy Crest began to install cutting-edge equipment to process whey that could then be sold to baby formula manufacturers and as probiotic food additives. However, that equipment didn't work as it was meant to, and over several years, the company basically dumped liquid waste, suspended soil, and biological sludge into the river, raising its nutrient levels and killing trout and salmon. And part treated effluent also leaked onto the nearby land, and in one incident, treated effluent from the creamery was also released into the river, containing a biocide that killed hundreds of fish. And at the sentencing hearing, at which the Dairy Crest CEO Tom Atherton was there, the company blamed some of the problems on contractors' design of new plant equipment. But the judge, Simon Carr, was critical of the company's reaction and basically said its senior and middle management had been involved at every stage and should have responded better. We could do better. And he noted that some of those responsible for managing the site's wastewater systems felt intimidated and bullied and criticized for the fact that the equipment continued to be used even after it failing. So again, like stuff like this happens all the time. And so when you do have clients that are looking at buying perhaps an existing farm or an existing piece of working agricultural land that already has infrastructure in it, you want to make sure that it's being run well, that it's being run properly, that the permits are in place, that there haven't been any breaches to it, because that all counts when we're looking at agricultural land. Another kind of interesting pollution issue. So we're looking now at the Solent. The Solent water environment is one of the most important for wildlife in this country. It's got various protected designated habitat sites, including special protection areas, Ramsar, and Solent Maritime Special Area of Conservation. Now, nitrates make their way into the water from our use of the surrounding land and primarily agricultural land. And agricultural sources, such as the use of fertilizers, accounts for about half of the total loading in the Solent. Other sources are urban, such as wastewater from housing, and there's also a significant proportion from unknown sources. So if the amount of nitrates that enter the water environment reaches a certain level, this causes something called eutrophication. And this is when green algae mats grow, depleting oxygen in the water. And consuming this water is harmful to human health and upsets the biodiversity and ecosystems of the water environment. And this has actually been a concern for a while, and of course, it's a concern connected with the agricultural land use. In June 2019, Natural England sent advice to all local planning authorities in the Solent region, setting out guidelines for new development sites. And they advised that whilst there is uncertainty at this time as to whether new developments will further deteriorate the protected sites, one way to address the issue would be for development to achieve nutrient neutrality. So this would mean ensure the development does not make the nitrates loading into the Solent any worse. So if you're looking at potential agricultural land in areas like this, in areas that have special protection areas or special protection zones, just bear in mind that you may be asked to jump through extra hoops, or you may have even more rules put upon you because we need to make sure that the environment is being protected. Pollution issues prevent the local community from developing. And in some cases, they're actually, like in areas like Hampshire, these types of problems could actually be tackled by buying fields to turn into woodland or meadows or wetlands. So if you do have any clients that are looking at that, that is something that they could be doing to help the environment. So it's not all bad news, and it's not all pollution and whatnot, but again, agricultural land that is staying in agricultural use, regenerative farming, woodlands, meadows, all of those things are good things, and all of those things are needed for the environment to flourish. Now let's take a look a little bit about the future, because obviously we're now fully Brexited, I guess, and there are various schemes that the EU had been involved with when it comes to agriculture, and the agricultural sector is basically facing a period of transition that will significantly change the way the industry operates. Rural businesses will need to find and generate new income streams as new opportunities present themselves. However, with these new opportunities comes, of course, new challenges as the agriculture sector faces increasing demand to reduce its carbon footprint, whilst inflationary pressures are making everyday business and everybody's lives a bit more challenging these days. So you've got things like the sustainable farming incentive. So the ultimate aim of this scheme is to have 70% of farms and farmland across England to be part of the SFI by 2028. However, doubts have been cast about whether the scheme payments are lucrative enough to incentivize farmers to sign up. The SFI is the first of 3 new environmental schemes being introduced under the Agricultural Transition Plan, and the other 2 schemes are local nature recovery and landscape recovery. And so the SFI aims to want to help farmers manage land in a way that improves food production and is more environmentally sustainable. And farmers will be paid to provide public goods like improved water quality, like biodiversity, like climate change mitigation. You've also got schemes like reductions in basic payment schemes, so the BPS. The BPS is the largest rural government grant and payment available to the farming industry, but it's set to end in 2028 with significant reductions year on year in the intervening period. So farmers can apply for this grant each year and will need to comply with some rules in order to receive the grant. This reduction, though, is likely to create a financial shortfall for many farmers across the country that will need to be addressed. So that definitely needs to be looking at. Small increases in productivity will only be part of the answer for most farmers, as different opportunities will need to be considered moving forward. You've also got the lump sum exit scheme and delinking. So for those who are considering leaving their farm, DEFRA has announced a lump sum exit scheme, and this scheme is designed to free up land for those wishing to pursue farming and existing farmers wanting to expand. And the scheme offers a one-off lump sum for those looking to leave, whilst the amount is likely not going to be enough to necessarily persuade farmers to leave. It may be suitable for those already considering an exit. You've also got things like carbon management and trading. So this is an exciting opportunity for farmers and agricultural traders. And carbon trading has become a bit of a buzzword recently. This is because you can now trade carbon credits created from woodland, peatland, and soil. However, there is still significant uncertainty about how carbon trading will work and where prices will settle. They also need to consider how much carbon their business is emitting. So once you have this knowledge, you can calculate if you have any surplus that you can sell to third parties that do not affect their position from a financial, environmental, and reputational point of view. And another thing that's been put on the what do you call it, on our radar is ESG investing. So the agriculture sector is being affected by the focus on environmental and social governance considerations. Over the past few years, businesses have started to put more emphasis on ESG and corporate social responsibility in an effort to reduce their carbon emissions. Now, this trend is having an effect on the agriculture sector, as many businesses look to plant more trees, to get involved with rewilding, to deliver other ecosystem services. And this presents an opportunity for farmers to generate income streams from this increase in corporate business taking part in ESG investing. However, this does also come with a challenge, as farmers have been vocal about losing productive farmland, and the fact that if we lose productive farmland, we are going to impact food security. So these are all really interesting things and food for thought. We've also got changes to some of the laws. On the 27th of April this year, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill received royal assent and has become law. So Part 4 of the Act makes trespass a criminal offense for the first time. And campaigners against the new law say that this is a direct attack on the traditional way of life of Gypsy and traveling communities. The NBTA stands in solidarity with the rights of all nomadic people, and that was in the press fairly recently. The Act creates the new offense under the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994. Of residing or intending to reside on land without consent in or without a vehicle. It also amends the existing police powers in the previous 1994 Act to lower the threshold at which powers can be used, thereby allowing police to remove unauthorized encampments on or partly on highways, and to prohibit unauthorized encampments moved from a site from returning within 12 months. Yet, the Act does not do anything to address the very severe shortfall in lawful, temporary, and permanent stopping places that the traveling communities can live on. So that's a really interesting one. I think it's certainly controversial one. You've also got the right to roam. So the government basically squashed a review into the right to roam in England's countryside amid anger from campaigners that the law of trespass stops people from walking freely around the country. And it was revealed last year that the Treasury had commissioned Lord Agnew to lead a review into access to nature, asking respondents for radical joined-up thinking to achieve a shift in how our society supports people to access and engage with outdoors. And I think that's become even more of an issue post-COVID. Being outside and being in nature, I think, is important for everybody, and everybody should have that right. But now the government has said the review has been wound up and it's not going to be releasing any results. So currently, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act 2000 gives a legal right of public access to mountains, moorland heaths, and some downland and commons alongside the more recently created England Coastal Path. However, campaigns have asked for this to be extended to cover other types of areas like woods and greenbelt land. So again, think about that when you're looking at agricultural pieces of land. If you're near a river, if you are in greenbelt land, 97% of rivers are currently off limits to the public, and tens of thousands of acres of woodlands have benefited from public subsidy, and yet they remain publicly inaccessible. So again, not just thinking about farms, but thinking about other types of agricultural pieces of land for those clients that you have that are looking at those kind of outlying agricultural pieces of land. Finally, finishing up, this shouldn't take too much longer. I know we're running a little bit over. I'm really looking at the Groundsure Agricultural Report. So as I mentioned earlier, this particular report is for agricultural land and working farms that are staying in agricultural use. So if you've got a client that's looking at a big piece of agricultural land but is going to turn it into something else, this is not the report. That would be a review. But if you've got a client that is looking at agricultural land and it's keeping it that way, then this is the report that you're supposed to use, because it's got a lot of farm specific data, guidance, things like agricultural land classifications, open access lands, tree felling licenses. It is the report that takes us the longest to write. You've got 2 consultants that look at this report. It takes them about 3 days because there is a lot of information that we have to go through. Each report is written manually by one of our in-house environmental experts, and then it's basically peer reviewed by another of our experts, and it examines current and our comprehensive collection of over 1 million historical ordnance survey maps. It covers everything that is outlined in that section B8 on agricultural land in the Conveyancing Handbook. It provides the appropriate maps and the appropriate guidance. And each report has a section underneath the address and above the site plan, as you can see on the screen, which identifies who wrote the report and who reviewed it. So that means you have a direct line to the people who have actually written that report, and you can pick up the phone and actually speak to the person who wrote the report. Or if your client has any questions, they can do the same. They can pick up the phone and speak to the person that actually wrote and reviewed the report. Our consultants can be easily contacted. So we want to kind of take that responsibility off you, particularly when it comes to agricultural land, as they are very complex and we don't expect you to be the experts for these types of things. So that is available within the report. Now, when a Groundsure agricultural report identifies action required, it's often due to permits or other potentially contaminative activities having been identified within a working farm or a farmyard. And a focused environmental audit of a farm, we do them, and an audit of this area allows these issues to be addressed with any potentially significant liabilities identified. And this audit provides a really cost-effective way for clarifying these risks. So you can get something called a farm audit after getting an agricultural report. And a farm audit may also be useful when the report comprises an acceptable environmental risk, but liabilities may reside with the property that a purchaser should consider further, particularly in relation to the farmyard, or if certain features have been identified like sheep dibs or tanks. And the assessment will be undertaken by an experienced Groundsure consultant, and it'll include a site inspection or a site visit of the high-risk areas as identified within the original Groundsure agricultural report that you've purchased. So using a standard farmyard checklist, the consultant will basically assess the yard operations for the risk to the condition of the land and for the risk of regulatory enforcement. And the resulting audit will be provided in the form of a completed checklist, a summary of findings, and where appropriate, a reassessed agricultural report. So should a reassessed report not be available, the consultant will provide next steps to be undertaken. And we'll cover things like discharges to controlled waters requiring a license, any licensed and private abstraction inquiries, the review of operations to assess whether they fall under the Environmental Protection Act regulation, and if so, compliance with these requirements, application of oil storage regulations, inspection of farmyard for potentially significant land contamination, assessment of waste exemption or other waste management regulations requirements as they apply to the property. So this is more of a follow-on thing, but that is available particularly for any clients you've got that are looking at getting into farming specifically. And that is pretty much it from me. Apologies for overrunning by 5 minutes, but I hope you found this session useful. I hope you've found the information and what the differences are to be interesting but also complex. So thank you very much for giving me your time today. As always, if you've got any questions, let us know, or copy the recording, slides, and a little feedback survey that's going to launch shortly after this. Have a great rest of the afternoon.